Hello bookworms, I'm Hannah, and this is part 7, the final part of my Bailey's Women's Prize video series in which I review all 16 of the books that were longlisted for this year's prize. If you missed the first 6 parts of this series, I'll provide links to those videos down below. The moment has finally arrived when I can talk about my #1 pick from the entire longlist. It's the only longlist book I gave a 5-star review. That is The Sport of Kings by C.E. Morgan, a literary saga about 2 families whose lives are entwined by a mutual interest in breeding the next thoroughbred superhorse. This was a rare instance of a multi-generational saga not just holding my interest, but captivating me at every turn. The book is nearly 550 pages long and has some of the tiniest font I have ever seen. Look at that. Look how tiny that is. So I'll admit that I was a little worried going in that I wouldn't like it and would be trapped in this enormous book that I'd publicly committed to reading, but I remained hopeful that Morgan would make use of the extra page count to nurture her readers' interest in her characters, and unlike so many others who have failed in that regard, Morgan actually succeeds. She makes a smart move by selecting 3 characters to really focus on, and then occasionally drops in interludes that are basically short stories that briefly examine the ancestors of the 3 primary protagonists. It works. The short stories break up the narrative at perfectly timed intervals, and the primary protagonists get sufficient, in fact ample, backstories, and they each get enough time in the spotlight to fully materialize as believable characters. 2 of the main protagonists are white Southerners whose family is one of the oldest and most powerful dynasties in Kentucky. There's Henry Forge, who is a proud, racist, and uncompromising man, and his daughter Henrietta, who shares her father's fascination with breeding thoroughbred horses. The 3rd character is Almond Shaughnessy, a young African-American man who's a descendant of slaves that comes to work on the Forge farm. Both the Forge family legacy and Almond's future are tied up in successfully breeding the next Triple Crown winner. One of the elements of this book I found pleasing was how unlikable the characters are, and what I mean by that is they seem like real people who just happen to be flawed in detestable ways, and I got caught up in wondering what horrible thing they would do next. Some of their activities really turned my stomach, which is another way of saying I had strong reactions to this book, but in a good way. In fact, this book made me audibly gasp twice. To me, that's a sign of effective writing and storytelling. This book is arguably character-driven, but I was also taken with Morgan's stylistic approach to conveying the narrative. The setting, in particular, is readily imaginable because of the many details Morgan provides. She describes crickets thrumming, the hot, humid air as being restless, cool streams and fertile soil, so much bird song that it's almost grating, cows moaning and horses whickering, fields of corn and tobacco extending as far as the eye can see, and the rest of the undulating earth being cloaked in varying shades of green. She also steals moments to step away from the storyline and inject a paragraph or 2 about something grand, like the way bones and sinew and flesh are tied neatly together, or she proclaims that everything comes from everything and gives us this cinematic fast-forward description that moves from single cells through nature to the human body. And she's not coy about the grandiosity of these flourishes. She asks in the narrative, have I committed a literary sin? Is this too purple, too florid? Would you prefer that your books be honed to a single digestible point? Some people do prefer or need their books to be consumable in manageable bites, so I can understand how these stints of looking at the big picture in fine detail might make some readers feel impatient. But as a writer, I can't help but appreciate the amount of fortitude and dedication required to hit the pause button amidst crafting an expansive saga, just to give a manuscript the amount of attention required to craft these stunning micro-examinations. Several poignant themes are woven throughout The Sport of Kings, and some of the criticism I've heard about this book is that its themes are too obvious. I don't know if I could disagree with that statement, but my response to it is, who cares? Unearthing a book's themes needn't always be an exhausting archaeological dig. Sometimes it's nice to spend less time digging up themes and more time contemplating and examining them. Morgan touches on race, class, and social and genetic ancestry. I think she draws a fearless parallel between the barbarism of horse racing and slavery by highlighting forced breeding that's tantamount to rape, beatings for non-compliant behavior, and selling horses and their young on the auction block. Symbols of fertility are ever present, and there's a fair amount of birds and mention of bird cages, which is fitting given how often the characters feel trapped by their circumstances. The Forges and Almond aren't the only ones who are trapped. We also follow several generations of horses who are prisoners to the demands of the Forge family. These horses bear the physical burden of birthing the best horse or winning the next perilous race. Speaking of which, the horse races are so vividly rendered that reading about them was thrilling and distressing in equal measure. For example, suddenly the bell rings, the gates are sprung, the sky hurls infective rain, and the horses unfurl their colors before the crowd. They move through the gray veil of rain, gathering speed, charging on brittle bones, swinging as a single body around the track, shod hooves spattering mud. The mud is inside of everywhere, mud slung over saddles, in the eyes of the horses, caking the goggles of the jocks, which are stripped again and again and again. The wind whips the group from behind, pressing them to greater speeds, but in the downpour, so they run sloppily, jostling and bumping and sliding, crossing the track with their lungs bursting and their nostrils bleeding. Some strident literary types may be repulsed by this book, but as an every woman who likes to dip into all kinds of different genres, and as a writer, I am here to unabashedly proclaim that I find this book awe-inspiring. I was ecstatic to see it on the shortlist, and I desperately want it to win this year's prize. I recommend this book to anyone who's in the mood for an atmospheric, lyrically written saga that explores accessible themes through psychologically complex characters. My final say? Finding this book is what made reading the entire long list totally worthwhile. The Sport of Kings is a literary triumph. That concludes my Bailey's Women's Prize video series. This project has consumed my life for the last 2.5 months and really cut into my reading time. It's been a fun and challenging endeavor, but I am ready to move forward. All that remains is to wait and see which book gets this year's prize. The winner will be announced on June 7th. This is the horse I'm betting on. Which shortlist book are you hoping wins the 2017 Bailey's Women's Prize? Tell me in the comments below. Thanks, everybody!